Hey everybody, this is chapter 10 of The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Texts of Critical Marxism, Volume 2, The Two Trotskyisms Confront Stalinism, edited by Sean Madgamna. I swear to God, whenever I start reading, I start burping. It's embarrassing. It's not embarrassing. I don't actually give a shit, but I can see it disgusting some people. Anyway, this is chapter 10 of that book, and it's which is titled "Leon Trotsky is Dead?" ? Long live Trotsky! ! It starts with a quote, which just says, quote, "In answer to the, quote, independent thinkers, end quote, Cannon used to say, quote, Trotsky is my brain, end quote, end quote. Felix Morrow, Minority Report, 1946. The first piece of this chapter is titled, or labeled, To the Memory of the Old Man by James P. Cannon. And this is abridged from a speech at the Leon Trotsky Memorial Meeting in New York on the 28th of August, 1940, Socialist Appeal, 6th of September, 1940. This speech was also published as a pamphlet. So here we go. Comrade Trotsky's entire conscious life, from the time Comrade Trotsky entered the workers' movement in the provincial Russian town of Nikolaev at the age of 18 up till the moment of his death in Mexico City 42 years later, was completely dedicated to work and struggle for one central idea. Trotsky stood for the emancipation of the workers and all the oppressed people of the world, and the transformation of society from capitalism to socialism by means of a social revolution. In Trotsky's conception, this liberating social revolution requires, for success, the leadership of a revolutionary political party of the workers' vanguard. In his entire conscious life, Comrade Trotsky never once diverged from that idea. Trotsky never doubted it and never ceased to struggle for its realization. On his deathbed, in his last message to us, Trotsky's disciples, Trotsky's last testament, Trotsky proclaimed his confidence in his life idea, quote, "Tell our friends I am sure of the victory of the Fourth International, go forward," end quote. The whole world knows about Trotsky's work and Trotsky's testament. The cables of the press of the world have carried Trotsky's last testament and made it known to the world's millions. And in the minds and hearts of all those throughout the world who agree with us tonight, one thought, one question is uppermost. Will the movement which Trotsky created and inspired survive Trotsky's death? Will Trotsky's disciples be able to hold their ranks together? Will Trotsky's disciples be able to carry out Trotsky's testament and realize the emancipation of the oppressed through the victory of the Fourth International? Without the slightest hesitation, we give an affirmative answer to this question. Those enemies who predict a collapse of Trotsky's movement without Trotsky, and those weak-willed friends who fear it, only show that they do not understand Trotsky, what Trotsky was, what Trotsky signified, and what Trotsky left behind. Never has a bereaved family been left such a rich heritage as that which Comrade Trotsky, like a provident father, has left to the family of the Fourth International as trustees for all progressive humanity. A great heritage of ideas he has left to us, ideas which shall chart the struggle toward the great free future of all mankind. The mighty ideas of Trotsky are our program and our banner. They are a clear guide to action in all the complexities of our epoch and a constant reassurance that we are right and that our victory is inevitable. Trotsky himself believed that ideas are the greatest power in the world. Their authors may be killed, but ideas once promulgated live their own life. If they are correct ideas, they make their way through all obstacles. This was the central dominating concept of Comrade Trotsky's philosophy. Trotsky explained it to us many, many times. Trotsky once wrote, quote, "It is not the party that makes the program, bracket, the idea, end bracket. It is the program that makes the party," end quote. In a personal letter to me, Trotsky once wrote, quote, "We work with the most correct and powerful ideas in the world with inadequate numerical facts and material means, but correct ideas in the long run always conquer and make available for themselves the necessary material means and forces." End quote. Trotsky, a disciple of Marx, believed with Marx that, quote, "an idea, when that idea permeates the masses, becomes a material force," end quote. Believing that, Comrade Trotsky never doubted that his work would live after him. Believing that, he could proclaim on his deathbed his confidence in the future victory of the Fourth International, which embodies his ideas. Those who doubt it do not know Trotsky. Trotsky himself believed that his greatest significance, his greatest value, consisted not in his physical life, not in his epic deeds, which overshadow those of all heroic figures in history in their sweep and their grandeur, but in what Trotsky would leave behind him after the assassins had done their work. Trotsky knew that his doom was sealed, and Trotsky worked against time in order to leave everything possible to us and through us to mankind. Throughout the 11 years of Trotsky's last exile, Trotsky chained himself to his death like a galley slave and labored, as none of us knows how to labor, with such energy, such persistence and self-discipline as only men of genius can labor. Trotsky worked against time to pour out through his pen the whole rich content of his mighty brain and preserve it in permanent written form for us and for those who will come after us. The whole Trotsky, like the whole Marx, is preserved in Trotsky's books, his articles and letters. Trotsky's voluminous correspondence, which contains some of his brightest thoughts and his most intimate personal feelings and sentiments, must now be collected and published. When that is done, when Trotsky's letters are published alongside Trotsky's books, Trotsky's pamphlets, and Trotsky's articles, we may, and all those who join us in the libertarian struggle of humanity, will still have our old man to help us. He knew that the superborgia in the Kremlin, Cain Stalin, who has destroyed the whole generation of the October Revolution, had marked Trotsky for assassination and would succeed sooner or later. That is why Trotsky worked so urgently. That is why Trotsky hastened to write out everything that was in his mind and get it down on paper in permanent form where nobody could destroy it. Just the other night, I talked at the dinner table with one of the old man's faithful secretaries, a young comrade who had served Trotsky a long time and knew his personal life as he lived it in his last years of exile most intimately. I urged him to write his reminiscences without delay. I said, quote, "We must all write everything we know about Trotsky. Everyone must record his recollections and his impressions. We must not forget that we moved in the orbit of the greatest figure of our time. Millions of people, generations yet to come, will be hungry for every scrap of information, every word, every impression that throws light on Trotsky, Trotsky's ideas, Trotsky's aims, and Trotsky's personal life." End quote. He answered, quote, I can write only about his personal qualities as I observe them, his methods of work, his humaneness, his generosity, but I can't write anything new about his ideas. They are already written." Hi, doggy. Everything he had to say, everything he had in his brain is down on paper. He seemed to be determined to scoop down to the bottom of his mind and take out everything and give it to the world in his writings. Very often, I remember, casual conversations on some subject would come up at the dinner table. An informal discussion would take place, and the old man would express some opinions new and fresh. Almost invariably, the contributions of the dinner table conversation would find expression a little later in a book, an article, or a letter. End quote. They killed Trotsky not by one blow, not when his murderer, the agent of Stalin, drove the pickaxe through the back of his skull. That was only the final blow. They killed him by inches. They killed him many times. They killed him 7 times when they killed his 7 secretaries. They killed him 4 times when they killed his 4 children. They killed him when his old co-workers of the Russian Revolution were killed. Yet Trotsky stood up to his tasks in spite of all that. Growing old and sick, Trotsky staggered through all these moral, emotional, and physical blows to complete his testament to humanity while he still had time. He gathered it all together, every thought, every idea, every lesson from his past experience to lay up a literary treasure for us, a treasure that the moths and the rust cannot eat. Trotsky was a great man of action, to be sure. Trotsky's deeds are incorporated in the greatest revolution in the history of mankind. But unlike the opportunists and leaders of a day, his deeds were inspired by great ideas, and these ideas still live. Trotsky not only made a revolution, Trotsky wrote that revolution's history and explained the basic laws which govern all revolutions. In his History of the Russian Revolution, which he considered his masterpiece, Trotsky gave a guide to the making of new revolutions, or, rather, for extending throughout the world the revolution that began in October 1917. Trotsky, the great man of ideas, was himself the disciple of a still greater one, Marx. Trotsky did not originate or claim to originate the most fundamental ideas which Trotsky expounded. Trotsky built on the foundations laid by the great masons of the 19th century, Marx and Engels. In addition, Trotsky went through the great school of Lenin and learned from Lenin. Trotsky's genius consisted in his complete assimilation of the ideas bequeathed by Marx, Engels, and Lenin. He mastered their method, he developed their ideas in modern conditions, and applied them in masterful fashion in the contemporary struggle of the proletariat. If you would understand Trotsky, you must know that Trotsky was a disciple of Marx, an orthodox Marxist. Trotsky fought under the banner of Marxism for 42 years. During the last year of Trotsky's life, he laid everything else aside to fight a great political and theoretical battle in defense of Marxism in the ranks of the Fourth International. Trotsky's very last article, which was left on his desk in unpolished form, the last article with which he occupied himself, was a defense of Marxism against contemporary revisionists and skeptics. The power of Trotsky, first of all and above all, was the power of Marxism. Do you want a concrete illustration of the power of Marxist ideas? Just consider this. When Marx died in 1883, Trotsky was but 4 years old. Lenin was only 14. Neither could have known Marx or anything about Marx, yet both became great historical figures because of Marx. Because of Marx had circulated ideas in the world before Lenin and Trotsky were born. Those ideas were living their own life. They shaped the lives of Lenin and Trotsky. Marx's ideas were with them and guided their every step when they made the greatest revolution in history. So will the ideas of Trotsky, which are development of the ideas of Marx, influence us, his disciples, who survive him today. They will shape the lives of far greater disciples who are yet to come and who do not yet know Trotsky's name. Some who are destined to be the greatest Trotskyists are playing in the schoolyards today. They will be nourished on Trotsky's ideas as he and Lenin were nourished on the ideas of Marx and Engels. Our movement was built firmly from the very beginning and has remained firm because it was built on Trotsky's ideas. In the sections of the Fourth International throughout the world, only a very few individual comrades had ever met Trotsky face to face, yet everywhere they knew him. In China, across the oceans to Chile, Argentina, Brazil, in Australia, in practically every country of Europe, in the United States, Canada, Indochina, South Africa, they never saw Trotsky, but the ideas of Trotsky welded them all together in one uniform and firm world movement, so it will continue after his physical health. There is no room for doubt. Trotsky's place in history is already established. Trotsky will stand forever on a historical eminence besides the other three great giants of the proletariat, Marx, Engels, and Lenin. It is possible, indeed, it is quite probable, that in the historic memory of mankind, Trotsky's name will evoke the warmest affection, the most heartfelt gratitude of all, because Trotsky fought so long against such a world of enemies, so honestly, so heroically, and with such selfless devotion. Future generations of free humanity will look back with insatiable interest on this mad epoch of reaction and bloody violence and social change. This epoch of the death agony of one social system and the birth pangs of another. When they see through the historian's lens how the oppressed masses of the people everywhere were groping, blinded and confused, they will mention with unbounded love the name of the genius who gave us light, the great heart that gave us courage. Of all the great men of our time, of all the public figures to whom the masses turned for guidance in these terrible times, Trotsky alone explained things to us. Trotsky alone gave us light in the darkness. Trotsky's brain alone unraveled the mysteries and complexities of our epoch. The great brain of Trotsky was what was feared by all his enemies. They couldn't cope with it. They couldn't answer it. In the incredibly horrible method by which they destroyed Trotsky, there was hidden a deep symbol. They struck at Trotsky's brain, but the richest products of that brain are still alive. They had already escaped and can never be recaptured and destroyed. We do not minimize the blow that has been dealt to us, to our movement, and to the world. Is the worst calamity. We have lost something of immeasurable value that can never be regained. We have lost the inspiration of Trotsky's physical presence, his wise counsel. All that is lost forever. Trotsky still lived in the hearts of the Russian people. They didn't believe the lies. They waited in hope for Trotsky's return. His words are still there. His memory is alive in their hearts. Just a few days before the death of Comrade Trotsky, the editors of the Russian Bulletin received a letter from Riga. It had been mailed before the incorporation of Latvia into the Soviet Union. It stated in simple words that Trotsky's open letter to the workers of the USSR had reached them and had lifted up their hearts with courage and shown them the way. The letter stated that the message of Trotsky had been memorized, word by word, and would be passed along by word of mouth no matter what might happen. We verily believe that the words of Trotsky will live longer in the Soviet Union than the bloody regime of Stalin. In the coming great day of liberation, the message of Trotsky will be the banner of the Russian people. The English historian Macaulay remarked that apostates in all ages have manifested an exceptional malignity towards those whom they have betrayed. Stalin and his traitor gang were consumed by a mad hatred of the man who reminded them of their yesterday. Trotsky, the symbol of the Great Revolution, reminded them constantly of the cause they had deserted and betrayed, and they hated him for that. They hated him for all the great and good human qualities which he personified and in which they were completely alien. They were determined at all costs to do away with him. We saved him for 11 years. Those were the most fruitful years of his whole life. Those were the years when he sat down in the full maturity to devote himself to the task of summing up and casting in permanent literary form the results of his experiences and his thoughts. Their dull police minds cannot know that Trotsky left the best of his life. Their dull police minds cannot know that Trotsky left the best of himself behind. Even in death, Trotsky frustrated them, because the thing they wanted most of all to kill, the memory and hope of revolution, that Trotsky left behind him. At the hour Comrade Trotsky was finally struck down, I was returning by train from a special journey to Minneapolis. I had gone there for the purpose of arranging for new and especially qualified comrades to go down and strengthen the guard in Coyoacán. On the way home, I sat in the railroad train with a feeling of satisfaction that the task of the trip had been accomplished, reinforcements of the guard had been provided for. Then, as the train passed through Pennsylvania about 4 o'clock in the morning, they brought the early papers with the news that the assassin had broken through the defenses and driven a pickaxe into the brain of Comrade Trotsky. That was the beginning of a terrible day, the saddest day of our lives, when we waited hour by hour, while the old man fought his last fight and struggled vainly with death. But even then, in that hour of terrible grief, when we received the fatal message over the long-distance telephone, quote, "The old man is dead," end quote, even then we didn't permit ourselves to stop for weeping. We plunged immediately into the work to defend Trotsky's memory and carry out his testament. And we worked harder than ever before, because for the first time we realized with full consciousness that we have to do it all now. We can't lean on the old man anymore. What is done now, we must do. That is the spirit in which we have got to work from now on. Trotsky was the world's exile in this time of reaction. No door was open to Trotsky anywhere except that of the Republic of Mexico. The capitalists all kinds fear and hate even his dead body. The doors of our great democracy are open to many political refugees, of course. All sorts of reactionaries, democratic scoundrels who betrayed and deserted their people, monarchists, and even fascists. They have all been welcomed to New York Harbor. But not even the dead body of the great friend of the oppressed could find asylum here. We shall not forget that. We shall nourish that grievance close in our hearts, and in good time we shall take our revenge. The great and powerful democracy of Roosevelt and Hull wouldn't let us bring his body here for the funeral, but he is here just the same. All of us feel that Trotsky is here in this hall tonight, not only in Trotsky's great ideas, but also especially tonight in our memory of Trotsky as a man. We have a right to be proud that the best man of our time belonged to us. The greatest brain and strongest and most loyal heart. The class society we live in exalts the rascals, cheats, self-seekers, liars, and oppressors of the people. You can hardly name an intellectual representative of the decaying class society of high or low degree who is not a miserable hypocrite and contemptible coward, concerned first of all with his own inconsequential personal affairs and saving his own worthless skin. What a wretched tribe they are. There is no honesty, no inspiration, nothing in the whole of them. They have not a single man that can strike a spark in the heart of youth. Our old man was made of better stuff. Our old man was made of entirely different stuff. He towered above these pygmies in his moral grandeur. Comrade Trotsky not only struggled for a new social order based on human solidarity as a future goal, Trotsky lived every day of his life according to its higher and nobler standards. We about to walk the dogs?
Yeah.
Can I come?
Yeah.
Give me 1 second. Where am I? They wouldn't let him be a citizen of any country, but in truth, Trotsky was much more than that. Trotsky was already, in his mind and his conduct, a citizen of the communist future of humanity. That memory of him... I'll be out in 1 second. That memory of him as a man, as a comrade, is more precious than gold and rubies. We can hardly understand a man of that type living among us. We are all caught in the steel net of the class society with its inequalities, its contradictions, its conventionalities, its false values, its lies. The class society poisons and corrupts everything. We are all dwarfed and twisted and blinded by it. We can hardly visualize what human revelations will be. We can hardly comprehend what the personality of man will be in a free society. Comrade Trotsky gave us an anticipatory picture. In Trotsky and Trotsky's personality as a man, as a human being, we caught a glimpse of the communist man that is to be. This memory of him as a man, as a comrade, is our greatest assurance that the spirit of man, striving for human solidarity, is unconquerable. In our terrible epoch, many things will pass away. Capitalism and all its heroes will pass away. Stalin and Hitler and Roosevelt and Churchill and all the lies and injustices and hypocrisy they signify. All the lies and injustices and hypocrisy they signify will pass away in blood and fire. But the spirit of the communist man, which Comrade Trotsky represented, will not pass away. Destiny has made us men of common clay, the most immediate disciples of Comrade Trotsky. We now become Trotsky's heirs, and we are charged with the mission to carry out his testament. Trotsky had confidence in us. Trotsky assured us with his last words that we are right and that we will prevail. We need only have confidence in ourselves and in the ideas, the tradition and the memory of which he left us as our heritage. We owe everything to Trotsky. We owe to Trotsky our political existence, our understanding, our faith in the future. We are not alone. There are others like us in all parts of the world. Always remember that. We are not alone. Trotsky has educated cadres of disciples. Trotsky has educated cadres of disciples in more than 30 countries. They are convinced to the marrow of their bones, the marrow of their bones, of their right to victory. They will not falter, neither shall we falter. Quote, I am sure of the victory of the Fourth International, end quote, said Comrade Trotsky in the last moment of his life. So are we sure. Trotsky never doubted, and we shall never doubt that, armed with his weapons, with his ideas, we shall lead the oppressed masses of the world out of the bloody welter of the war into a new socialist society. That is our testimony here tonight at the grave of Comrade Trotsky. Farewell to our greatest comrade and teacher, who has now become our most glorious martyr. We do not deny the grief that constricts all our hearts, but ours is not the grief of prostration, the grief that saps the will. Our grief is tempered by rage and hatred and determination. We shall transmute it into fighting energy to carry on the old man's fight. Let us say farewell to Trotsky in a manner worthy of his disciples, like good soldiers of Trotsky's army, not crouching in weakness and despair, but standing upright, with dry eyes and clenched fists, with a song of struggle and victory on our lips, with the song of confidence in Trotsky's Fourth International, the international party that shall be the human race! Exclamation point. Again, this piece was labeled To the Memory of the Old Man by James Buchanan, 1940. And it was an abridged speech at the Leon Trotsky Memorial Meeting in New York on the 28th of August, 1940. Socialist Appeal, 6th of September, 1940. This speech was also published as a pamphlet. The next piece is titled, What is Trotskyism? And it's by Max Shachtman from 1940. It says, this is from The Struggle for the New Course, preface to an edition of Trotsky's The New Course, 1943. Our criticism of Trotsky's later theory of the, quote, workers' state, end quote, introduces in it an indispensable correction. Far from, quote, demolishing, end quote, Trotskyism, our criticism of Trotsky's later theory of the, quote, workers' state, end quote, eliminates from it a distorting element of contradiction and restores its essential inner harmony and continuity. The writer considers himself a follower of Trotsky, as of Lenin before him, and of Marx and Engels in the earlier generation. Such has been the intellectual havoc wrought in the revolutionary movement by the manners and standards of Stalinism that, quote, follower, end quote, has come to mean serf, worshipper, or parrot. We have no desire to be this kind of, quote, follower. Trotsky was not, and we learned much of what we know from Trotsky. In the New Course, Trotsky wrote these jeweled words, which are worth repeating 100 times, quote, if there is one thing likely to strike a mortal blow to the spiritual life of the party and to the doctrinal training of the youth, it is certainly the transformation of Leninism from a method demanding for its application initiative, critical thinking, and ideological courage into a canon which demands nothing more than interpreters appointed for good and eye. Leninism cannot be conceived of without theoretical breadth, without a critical analysis of the material bases of the political process. The weapon of Marxian investigation must be constantly sharpened and applied. It is precisely in this that tradition consists, and not in the substitution of a formal reference or of an accidental quotation. Least of all can Leninism be reconciled with ideological superficiality and theoretical slovenliness. Quote, oh no, this is still the quote, sorry. Same quote, sorry. Lenin cannot be chopped up into quotations suited for every possible case, because for Lenin the formula never stands higher than the reality. It is always the tool that makes it possible to grasp the reality and to dominate the reality. It would not be hard to find in Lenin dozens and hundreds of passages which, formally speaking, seem to be contradictory. But what must be seen is not the formal relationship of one passage to another, but the real relationship of each of them to the concrete reality in which the formula was introduced as a lever. The Leninist truth is always concrete. Leninism is orthodox, obdurate, irreducible, but it does not contain so much as a hint of formalism, canon, nor bureaucratism. In the struggle, Leninism takes the bull by the horns. To make out of the traditions of Leninism a super-theoretical guarantee of the infallibility of all the words and thoughts of the interpreters of these traditions is to scoff at genuine revolutionary tradition and transform genuine revolutionary tradition into official bureaucratism. It is ridiculous and pathetic to try to hypnotize a great revolutionary party by the repetition of the same formula, according to which the right line should be sought not in the essence of each question, not in the methods of posing and solving this question, but in information ... of a biographical character, end quote. Trotsky. There are, quote, followers, end quote, who seem to think that the whole of Trotskyism, parenthesis, that is, the revolutionary Marxism of our time, end parenthesis, is contained in the theory that Russia is still a worker state, and in the slogan of, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, end quote. They merely prove that they have retired from a life of active and critical thought and from the realities of life in general, and confine themselves to memorizing by heart 2 pages of an otherwise uncut and unread book. They would be the first to deny, by the way, that the whole of Leninism is contained in Lenin's theory of the, quote, democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, end quote, or in Lenin's strictures against Trotsky and the theory of the permanent revolution. The whole of Trotsky for the new generation of Marxists that must be trained up and organized does not lie in his contradictory theory of the class character of Russia, is not even a decisively important part of the whole. Trotskyism is all of Marx, Engels, and Lenin that has withstood the test of time and struggle, and that is a good deal. Trotskyism is the leader's magnificent development and amplification of the theory of the permanent revolution. Trotskyism is the defense of the great and fundamental principles of the Russian Bolshevik Revolution and the Communist International, which it brought into existence. Trotskyism is the principle of workers' democracy, of the struggle for democracy and socialism. In this sense, and it is the only one worth talking about, the new course is a Trotskyist classic. It was not only a weapon hitting at the very heart of decaying bureaucratism in revolutionary Russia. It was and is a guide for the struggle against the vices of bureaucratism throughout the labor and revolutionary movements. Bureaucratism is not simply a direct product of certain economic privileges acquired by the officialdom of the labor movement. Bureaucratism is also an ideology. Bureaucratism is also an ideology, a concept of leadership and of the leadership's relationship to the masses, which is absorbed even by labor and revolutionary officialdoms who enjoy no economic privilege at all. Bureaucratism is an ideology that reeks of its bourgeois origin. Boiled down to its most vicious essence, bureaucratism is the kind of thinking and living and leading which says to the rank and file, in the words Trotsky once used to describe the language of Stalinism, quote, "No thinking, those at the top have more brains than you," end quote. We see this ideology reflected in the everyday conduct of our own American trade union bureaucracy, quote, "We will handle everything, leave things to us. You stay where you are and keep still," end quote. We see it reflected throughout the big social democratic, to say nothing of the Stalinist parties, quote, "We will negotiate things, we will arrange everything, we will maneuver cleverly with the enemy and get what you want without struggle. You sit still until further orders. That is all you are fit for," end quote. We even see it in those smaller revolutionary groups which are outside the reformist and Stalinist movements, which consider that this fact alone immunizes them from bureaucratism. We repeat, it is a bourgeois ideology through and through. It is part of the ideas that the bourgeoisie, through all its agencies for molding the mind of the masses, seeks to have prevail. Quote, "Whatever criticism you may have to make of us, remember this. The masses are stupid. It is no accident that the masses are at the bottom of the social ladder. The masses are incapable of rising to the top. The masses need a ruler over them. The masses cannot rule themselves. For the masses' own good, the masses must be kept where they are," end quote. The new course does more than dismiss this odious ideology that fertilizes the mind of the labor bureaucracy. The new course analyzes this odious ideology's sources and this odious ideology's nature. The new course diagnoses the evil to perfection. The new course indicates the operation needed to remove the evil, and the tools with which to perform the operation. It is the same tool needed by the proletariat for the proletariat's emancipation everywhere. Its name is the democratically organized and controlled, self-acting, dynamic, critical, revolutionary political party of the working class. The counter-revolution in Russia was made possible only because Stalin blunted, then wore down, then smashed to bits this indispensable tool of the proletariat. The bureaucracy won, quote, "If Trotsky had been right," end quote, says the official iconographer of Stalin, Henri Barbusse. Quote, "He would have won," end quote. How simple. What a flattering compliment, ... to Hitler. The bureaucracy not only won, but consolidated its power on a scale unknown in any country of the world throughout all history. Stalin himself is now the Pope Tsar of the Russian Empire. But that is only how it seems on the surface. That is how it is only for a very short while, as history counts. Quote, "Any imbecile can rule with a stage of siege." Quote, "Any imbecile can rule with a state of siege," end quote, says Rochefort. Only the really powerful and competent can rule by establishing peaceful relations in the country. That the new bureaucracy, without a past and without a future, cannot do. The combined efforts of world capitalism cannot do that nowadays, still less the efforts of the Stalinist nobility. The Stalinist nobility has succeeded in establishing, quote, "socialism," end quote, for the Stalinist nobility's self, and, quote, in a single country, end quote. The Stalinist nobility will not live long enough to enjoy that, quote, socialism. Together with all modern rulers, the Stalinist nobility is doomed to perish in the unrelenting world crisis that the Stalinist nobility cannot solve, or to perish at the hands of an avenging socialist proletariat. Cromwell's round heads marched with Bibles in their hands. The militant proletariat needs no divine revelations or scriptural injunctions, no Bibles or saviors. But the militant proletariat will march to victory only if the militant proletariat's conscious vanguard has assimilated the rich and now more timely than ever lessons to be learned from the classic work of the organizer of the first great proletarian revolution. This piece was labeled in the book What is Trotskyism by Max Shachtman, and it is from The Struggle for the New Course, preface to an edition of Trotsky's The New Course, published in 1943. The next piece is titled What is Leninism by Leon Trotsky. It's from 1923, and this is from The New Course, the book The New Course. Leninism cannot be conceived of without theoretical breadth, without a critical analysis of the material bases of the political process. The weapon of Marxian investigation must be constantly sharpened and applied. It is precisely in this that the tradition consists, and not in the substitution of a formal reference of an accidental quotation. Least of all can Leninism be reconciled with ideological superficiality and theoretical slovenliness. Lenin cannot be chopped up into quotations suited for every possible case, because for Lenin the formula never stands higher than the reality. It is always the tool that makes it possible to grasp the reality and dominate it. It would not be hard to find in Lenin dozens and hundreds of passages which, formally speaking, seem to be contradictory. But what must be seen is not the formal relationship of one passage to another, but the real relationship of each of them to the concrete reality in which the formula was introduced as a lever. The Leninist truth is always concrete. As a system of revolutionary action, Leninism presupposes a revolutionary sense, sharpened by reflection and experience, which, in the social realm, is equivalent to the muscular sensation in physical labor. But revolutionary sense cannot be confused with demagogical flair. Demagogical flair may yield ephemeral successes, sometimes even sensational successes, but it is a political instinct of an inferior type. Demagogical flair always leans toward the line of least resistance. Leninism, on the other hand, seeks to pose and resolve the fundamental revolutionary problems. Leninism is, first of all, realism, the highest qualitative and quantitative appreciation of reality from the standpoint of revolutionary action. Precisely because of this, it is irreconcilable. Leninism is irreconcilable with the flight from reality behind the screen of hollow agitationalism, with the passive loss of time, with the haughty justification of yesterday's mistakes on the pretext of saving the tradition of the party. Leninism is genuine freedom from formalistic prejudices, from moralizing doctrinalism, from all forms of intellectual conservatism attempting to bind the will to revolutionary action. But to believe that Leninism signifies that, quote, anything goes, end quote, would be an irremediable mistake. Leninism includes the morality, not formal but genuinely revolutionary, of mass action in the mass party. Nothing is so alien to Leninism as functionary arrogance and bureaucratic cynicism. A mass party has that mass party's own morality, which is the bond of fighters in and for action. Demagogy is irreconcilable with the spirit of a revolutionary party, because demagogy is deceitful. By presenting one or another simple solution of the difficulties of the hour, demagogy inevitably undermines the next future, weakens the party's self-confidence. Swept by the wind and gripped by a serious danger, demagogy easily dissolves into panic. It is hard to juxtapose, even on paper, panic and Leninism. Leninism is warlike from head to foot. War is impossible without cunning, without subterfuge, without deception of the enemy. Victorious war cunning is a constituent element of Leninist politics. But at the same time, Leninism is supreme revolutionary honesty toward the party and the working class. Leninism admits of no fiction, no bubble-blowing, no pseudo-grandeur. Leninism is orthodox, obdurate, irreducible, but it does not contain so much as a hint of formalism, canon, or bureaucratism. In the struggle, Leninism takes the bull by the horns. Take out of the traditions of Leninism a supra-theoretical guarantee of infallibility of all the words and thoughts of the interpreters of these traditions as to scoff at genuine revolutionary tradition and transform genuine revolutionary tradition into social bureaucratism. It is ridiculous and pathetic to try to hypnotize a great revolutionary party by the repetition of the same formulae, according to which the right line should be sought not in the essence of each question, not in the methods of posing and solving this question, but in information of a biographical character. This character of the revolutionary tradition is bound up with the peculiar character of revolutionary discipline. Where tradition is conservative, discipline is passive and is violated at the first moment of crisis. Whereas in our party, tradition consists in the highest revolutionary activity, discipline attains discipline's maximum point. For discipline's decisive importance is constantly checked in action. Whereas in our party, tradition consists in the highest revolutionary activity, discipline attains its maximum point, for its decisive importance is constantly checked in action. Thence, the indestructible alliance of revolutionary initiative, of critical, bold elaboration of questions with iron discipline and action, and it is only by this superior activity that the youth can receive from the old this tradition of discipline and carry this tradition of discipline on. We cherish the tradition of Bolshevism as much as anybody, but let no one dare identify bureaucratism with Bolshevism, tradition with vacuous routine. Again, this piece was by Trotsky and is labeled "What is Leninism?" It's from 1923 and is from the New Course, which was published in 1923. The next piece is titled "Platforms and Events" by Leon Trotsky, and this is from 1930. This is very short. From a letter, quote, to the editorial board of Prometeo, end quote, the magazine of the Italian communists with allegiance to the ideas of Amadeo Bordiga. On the 19th of June, 1930, 4th International, September-October, 1947. You say that in all this time you have not departed an iota from the platform of 1925, which I had called an excellent document in many respects, but a platform is not created so as to, quote, not depart from it, end quote, but rather to apply and to develop it. The platform of 1925 is a good document for the year of 1925. In the 5 years that have elapsed, great events have taken place. In the platform, there is no answer whatever to those great events. To attempt replacing answers to questions which flow from the situation in 1930 by references to the 1925 platform is to uphold a policy of vagueness and evasiveness, ... Again, this piece was labeled "Platforms and Events" by Leon Trotsky from 1930, and was from a letter, quote, to the editorial board of Prometeo, end quote, the magazine of the Italian communists with allegiance to the ideas of Amadeo Bordiga. It's from the 19th of June, 1930, 4th International, September-October, 1947. I guess that was where it was published. The next piece is titled "Trotsky's Predictions Triumph," and it's by Joseph Hansen, and it's from 1940. It's from the, quote, "Go Forward," end quote, column, The Militant, 16th of November, 1940. 14 months ago, upon the invasion of Poland from the west by Hitler and from the east by the Red Army, the Social Democrats and those clinging to the Social Democrats' coattails were thrown into complete confusion by the complex events. With the disappearance of the Polish bourgeois government and the advance of Soviet troops, the Social Democrats and those clinging to their coattails were utterly incapable of foreseeing what might be expected to occur in the eastern occupied territories. Among our own ranks, certain elements raised the question of changing our slogan of unconditional defense of the Soviet Union because of the Red Army invasion of Poland. Leon Trotsky analyzed the Polish events on the 25th of September 1939 in an article, The USSR in War, in the following lucid words, quote, "It is more likely, however, that in the territories scheduled to become part of the USSR, the Moscow government will carry through the expropriation of the large landowners and statification of the means of production. This variant is most probable not because of the bureaucracy remains true to the socialist program, but because it is neither desirous nor capable of sharing the power and the privileges the latter entails with the old ruling classes in the occupied territories." Here an analogy literally offers itself. The first Bonaparte halted the revolution by means of military dictatorship. However, when the French troops invaded Poland, Napoleon signed a decree, quote, "Serfdom is abolished," end quote. This measure was dictated not by Napoleon's sympathies for the peasants nor by democratic principles, but rather by the fact that the Bonapartist dictatorship itself, not on feudal but on bourgeois, based itself not on feudal but on bourgeois property relations. Inasmuch as Stalin's Bonapartist dictatorship bases itself not on private but on state property, the invasion of Poland by the Red Army should, in the nature of the case, result in the abolition of private capitalist property, so as thus to bring the regime of the occupied territories into accord with the regime of the USSR, end quote. Trotsky, in his next paragraph, explains that this change in property relations should not, however, cause us to favor the invasion of Poland by the Red Army, since it would be, quote, "achieved in military bureaucratic fashion," end quote, and hence lower the capacity of the proletariat to defend the old conquest and to make new conquests through socialist revolution. Trotsky's conclusion was that class-conscious workers should condemn the invasion of Poland by the Red Army but continue their unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, including the new territorial gains. Trotsky saw the invasion as providing a remarkable demonstration of the analysis of the Fourth International, that the Soviet Union is still a worker state but suffering from bureaucratic deformations. Trotsky concluded that there was nothing, quote, "new in the situation," end quote, which should cause us to change our position of unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, end quote. This analysis by Trotsky drew derision from all sides, especially among those under the influence of the bourgeois war pressure. They declared that the invasion of Poland proved that there, quote, "was something entirely new in the situation," end quote, and that the Soviet Union had become a, quote, "imperialist," end quote, state seeking imperialist territorial gains. James Burnham, for example, declared that the policy of the Soviet state had become, quote, "imperialist or quasi-imperialist," end quote. Shachtman declared in a resolution dated September 28, 1939, that, quote, "Stalin and the Red Army thus played a flatly counter-revolutionary role in Poland. The bitter realities of the recent events, most particularly of the events in Poland, dictate a revision of our previous concept of the, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union," end quote, Max Shachtman. Now, it is possible to ascertain just who was right and who was wrong in their analysis of the events in Poland, not that we expect either Burnham or Shachtman to acknowledge themselves wrong. In an article in the press, Ludwig Luhrer, see glossary, reports that private capitalist property has been entirely abolished in the occupied territories of Poland. Quote, "The nationalization of big industrial enterprises and banks, was the first," end quote, he states. Then came other important financial institutions. Quote, "The small and middle-sized industries were a difficult matter," end quote, he continues. Quote, "No immediate nationalization was attempted. The owners remained in possession of their enterprises and were merely ordered to submit statements to the workers' delegates regarding the cost of production, wages paid, hours employed, and working conditions generally. For every branch of industry, and again for the individual concerns, councils consisting of representatives of the employees and the employers were established, which jointly fixed a, quote, just rate of profit," end quote, and supervised working and wage conditions. Quote, "However, that was a transitory situation. After 7 months, complete state ownership was established according to a government statement. The dual regime of employers and employees' control over production was, quote, ineffective and working to the disadvantage of state and industry," end quote. Therefore, abolition of private ownership in small and medium industries was decreed. A similar situation was created in the trades. Wholesalers and retailers were given a period of grace in which to wind up their enterprises and sell out their old stocks. After that, the Soviet State Trust refused to sell them supplies and private trade died." End quote. Already the Stalinist bureaucracy has purged the local organizations in the occupied territories of any elements who might prove anti-Stalinist. This was likewise predicted by Trotsky when Trotsky warned that the workers of Poland must organize resistance against the crushing totalitarian hand of Moscow. With nothing but the meager details furnished by the bourgeois press, dealing mainly with the bare fact of the invasion by the Red Army, Trotsky was able, from his analysis of the Soviet Union as a worker state with bureaucratic deformations, to predict with absolute accuracy the course which history actually took, a remarkable triumph of Marxian analysis. Again, this piece was labeled Trotsky's Predictions Triumph. It's by Joseph Hansen, 1940, and was originally published in the Go Forward, end quote, column, The Militant, 16th of November, 1940. The next piece is titled, or labeled, The Revolution is Very Near, by James P. Cannon, and it's from 1943. And this is from, quote, A Telegram to Natalia Trotsky from a Plenum and Banquet of the Socialist Workers' Party, end quote. The Militant, 6th of November, 1943. The Plenum of the National Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party, meeting for the 5th time during the Second World War, reaffirms the basic program of Trotskyism. Our analysis shows that Europe is now on the verge of proletarian revolution, that already the beginning of this revolution can be seen in Italy. In the very near future, full confirmations will be given to Trotsky's theses that for the oppressed toilers of the socialist United States of Europe will prove the only road out of totalitarianism and war. Despite the worst efforts of our enemies, despite their lies and slanders, their prisons and their assassins, our party has become firmer and stronger. In extending greetings to you, dear Natalia, our plenum also salutes all our friends and co-thinkers in other lands who have borne the brunt of cruelest blows. We assure them that the long period of reaction is rapidly drawing to a close, and that their day is now dawning, the day of great worldwide upsurge of the working class. Nothing can stop the development of our movement. Ideas cannot be slain, as Trotsky predicted. The program of Marxism will prove invincible. Again, this piece was labeled, The Revolution is Very Near. It's by James P. Cannon from 1943, and it's from A Telegram to Natalia Trotsky from a Plenum and Banquet of the Socialist Workers' Party. The Militant, 6th of November, 1943. The next piece is labeled Careless Thinkers Say the War is Over. It's by James P. Cannon, and it's from 1945. And it's from a speech at a meeting to mark the 28th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, 4th of November 1945, published in The Militant, 17th of November 1945. Again, this is titled Careless Thinkers Say the War is Over. James Buchanan, November 1945. Lenin and Trotsky linked their revolution directly to the German Revolution. Lenin and Trotsky said, quote, "We live in a beleaguered fortress until the European Revolution comes to our aid," end quote. None of the leaders of the Russian Revolution believed it could last very long if it remained by itself, alone and isolated in a capitalist world. But the Russian Bolsheviks built better than they knew. The revolution proved to be stronger than they or anyone else ever dreamed it could be. The Russian Revolution could not complete the Russian Revolution itself within the national borders of a single country, but in spite of that, in spite of the drawn-out delay of the European Revolution to which they had looked with such hope, the revolution in Russia didn't die. The revolution in Russia survived and struck deep roots into the soil. The property foundations laid by the revolution, the nationalization of industry and the planned economy proved to be far stronger than any previous calculations, even the most optimistic. But the isolated revolution encircled by a hostile capitalist world could not escape the ravages of a terrible reaction which set in on Russian soil. The reaction led to the renunciation of the international perspective and a nationalistic degeneration all along the line. The regime of workers' democracy based on the Soviets was replaced by a brutal totalitarian tyranny. The revolution was beheaded and a whole generation of Bolsheviks was massacred. The political rule of the workers was overthrown, but the economic conquest of the revolution displayed a great vitality. Thanks to that, the revolution survived 20 years of bureaucratic degeneration and betrayal and revealed an enormous power on the field of battle in the war with Nazi Germany, as Trotsky predicted it would. Trotsky alone analyzed and explained this phenomenon, hitherto unknown and unforeseen, unique in history, of an isolated worker state in a capitalist encirclement, mutilated and betrayed by a usurping bureaucracy, but surviving nevertheless, although in horribly degenerated form. Trotsky, and we following him, had far more confidence than others in the reserve power which the Soviet economic system would display in the war, but even we underestimated it by far. Even we underestimated the tremendous resources of power that were lodged in the basic achievements of the workers' revolution of 1917, when they swept away capitalist private property and reorganized production on a nationalized and planned basis. The frightful bureaucratic degeneration proceeded at an accelerated pace during the war. How far it has gone and how far it is yet to go before the upswing begins again, we do not know. But we are firmly convinced that the destiny of the revolution of 1917 is not yet decided. It will be decided in the further course of the war, which they call the, quote, peace. The accusation has been made against us, and not for the first time, that our theory is a religion with which we console ourselves, that our analysis of the Soviet Union, of what has been lost and what has been saved and what is still worth defending, is a religion. Those who made that accusation in the past, and there have been many of them, nearly always ended by placing their own faith in, quote, democratic and, quote, imperialism. We want nothing to do with that kind of religion in any case. Marxism and the Russian Revolution represent the union of theory and practice, the union of the word and the deed. Every tendency toward capitulation to the class enemy which we have known in the past, and we have known many, every one began with a revision of the theory and ended in repudiation of the deed. After the first flush of victory in 1917, each and every setback of the struggling revolution, every difficulty, every defeat brought new waves of disillusionment, and with them new experiments and new revisions of theory, and finally new capitulations in principle to the class enemy. The case of Professor Burnham is only the latest example. The case of Professor Burnham is recent enough to be remembered. He began with a revision of the Marxist theory of the state and the Marxist analysis of the Russian Revolution, and ended in the camp of American imperialism. That is the most disgraceful and shameful capitulation that one can make. It represents a real betrayal of humanity because American imperialism is the enemy of humanity. One who goes over into the camp that has a, quote, religion, end quote, which no self-respecting worker ought ever to become infected with. Stalinism itself began as a revision of Marxist theory and ended in class betrayal. Trotsky began his struggle against Stalin in the realm of a theoretical dispute over the revisionist theory of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, and the renunciation of the international character of the Russian Revolution. The Trotskyists understood the nature of Stalinism better and explained the nature of Stalinism earlier and fought Stalinism longer and harder than any others. Therefore, nobody needs to incite us against Stalinism. But vulgar, quote, anti-Stalinism, end quote, is no more revolutionary and no more attractive to us. We know where this, quote, anti-Stalinism, end quote, leads. Up to now, it has always led to the camp of, quote, democratic, end quote, imperialism. We can have no quarrel whatsoever with those who denounce Stalinism for Stalinism's bloody crimes against the workers, and they are legion. But excessive zeal in criticizing and denouncing the Soviet Union and those who still defend it, that part of it which is worthy of defense against imperialism, is subject to suspicion. The unbridled antagonism bordering on Russophobia which one can notice in the atmosphere these days is a very dangerous sentiment, especially at the present time, because it is perfectly clear to everybody that before any peace is concluded, the mobilization for the next stage of the war, a war against the Soviet Union, is already taking place, and proceeding at a feverish pace. Why? The preparations are going forward openly on all fronts. Who can be so blind as not to see them and understand them? On the diplomatic front, American imperialism is mobilizing its forces and lining up allies. On the economic front, American imperialism is granting or withholding loans and credits to serve its diplomatic aims. On the propaganda front, why the American people are being bombarded by a calculated campaign of prejudice to prepare them for another war of, quote, democracy, end quote, God help us, against the Soviet Union. And even on the military front, we read the brazen announcements in the papers every day now that the armies of Chiang Kai-shek engaged in the civil war in North Korea are armed, equipped, and even partly trained by American militarists. A tremendous wave of public sentiment against Russia, reminiscent of the early days of 1917 to 1919, which some of us remember, is being set into motion. The present agitation recalls again the days of the Soviet-Finnish War, when every Democrat, every liberal, every Russophobe, and every anti-Stalinist was waving the flag for war against the Soviet Union in the service of American imperialism. It was a little difficult, and it took some courage and independence of judgment to stand up against that terrific anti-Russian wave of sentiment and propaganda at the time of the Soviet-Finnish War. We see the same thing developing again today, helped along, as before, by the bestial crimes of Stalin. The crimes of Stalin inside the Soviet Union, in Poland, in Eastern Europe, and now in Korea, deal mortal blows to the prestige of the Soviet Union. In the occupied territories, the Red Army, under Stalinist leadership, behaves in such a way as to tear the heart out of the workers and disillusion them with the Soviet Union, and weaken their allegiance and friendship for it, and thus open the way for a more effective eventual mobilization of the capitalist world against it. Denouncing these crimes with all our soul, we must still strive to keep our balance and to seek the whole picture. To see behind the crimes and filth of Stalinism, the Soviet Union, and the stake which the workers of the world still have in the Soviet Union. Trotsky predicted that the fate of the Soviet Union would be decided in the war. That remains our firm conviction. Only we disagree with some people who carelessly think that the war is over. The war has only passed through one stage and is now in the process of regroupment and reorganization for the second. The war is not over, and the revolution which we said would issue from the war in Europe is not taken off the agenda. It has only been delayed and postponed, primarily for lack of leadership, for lack of sufficiently strong revolutionary party. The Fourth Internationalists all over the world are working to build that leadership, to build that party. Again, this piece was labeled "Careless Thinkers Say the War is Over" by James P. Cannon. And it's from a speech at a meeting to mark the 28th anniversary of the Russian Revolution on the 4th of November 1945, published in the Militant the 17th of November 1945. The next piece is labeled "Is World War II Really Not Over?" and it's by Felix Morrow of the Socialist Workers' Party, 1945. It's from a Socialist Workers' Party internal bulletin, It's from the Socialist Workers' Party internal bulletin, volume 7, number 13, December 1945. It's a motion on Comrade Cannon's speech on the Russian Revolution by Felix Morrow. The position of the party on the defense of the Soviet Union was fixed at the last convention. The resolution of that convention recognized that the slogan of defense was no longer to the fore, that, quote, "The fight for the defense of the Soviet Union against the military forces of Nazi Germany has essentially been won," end quote. That, quote, "The present reality is, the conspiracy of the imperialists and the Kremlin bureaucracy to strangle the revolution. We therefore push to the fore and emphasize today that section of our program embodied in the slogan, defense of the European Revolution against all its enemies," end quote. Today, just as at the time of the November 1944 convention, the present reality remains the conspiracy of the Big Three against the revolution, the pushing to the fore of the slogan defense of the European Revolution against all its enemies, and the receding into the background of the slogan of defense of the USSR remains correct, and will in all probability continue to be correct for a whole historical period. War is inevitable under capitalism, and therefore, if the revolution is not successful, a war among the big three is certain eventually. Just as preparations for World War II began immediately after World War I, so war preparations have begun already for World War III. But before World War III can take place, a whole series of economic and political preconditions must first come into existence, which do not now as yet exist. Party policy on this all-important question was stated in Comrade Ward's article, quote, "The Big Five at London," end quote, in the November 1945 Fourth International, that Washington is in no mood for war, that the tide of events is now running in the opposite direction, that the growing revulsion against war since the atomic bomb bridles the warmongers, that Washington now seeks to cash in on its war gains and therefore has material reasons for wishing peace, that the big three are held together by their common fear of revolution, and hence Stalin remains a firm ally of the Anglo-American imperialists for this reason. Entirely contrary to party policy, therefore, was Comrade Cannon's speech, militant November 17th, end parenthesis. Equally, his speech was in flagrant violation of the obvious facts. Particularly, we condemn the following central passage in his speech, quote, "A tremendous wave of public sentiment against Russia, reminiscent of the days of 1917 to 1919, is being set into motion. The present agitation recalls again the days of the Soviet-Finnish War, when every Democrat, every liberal, every Russophobe, every anti-Stalinist was waving the flag for war against the Soviet Union, ... We see the same thing developing again today, ... Trotsky predicted that the fate of the Soviet Union would be decided in the war. That remains our firm conviction. Only we disagree with some people who carelessly think that the war is over. The war has only passed through one stage and is now in the process of regroupment and reorganization for the second. The war is not over, and the revolution which we said would issue from the war in Europe is not taken off the agenda, ... end quote. We condemn the above passages for the following reasons. 1. There is no analogy between the present reality and the situation in 1917 to 1919 or during the Soviet-Finnish War. Were there an analogy, our whole party, press, and activity would have to undergo a decisive change. Our principal slogan would become, quote, "Defense of the Soviet Union," end quote. Our press would be devoted to that task, etc., etc. What is at issue here is not a mere matter of prediction concerning when the next war will come, but what should be the content of our political work during the whole next period. Comrade Cannon's line plays into the hands of the Stalinists, who are raising a hue and cry about the war danger, precisely in order to cover up the fact that the big three remain united in their attempts to strangle the revolution. Our emphasis must be the opposite of that of the Stalinists, namely that both the Kremlin and the Stalinists abroad continue their counter-revolutionary collaboration with the bourgeoisie. 3. World War II is over. Our prediction that during the course of the war the Soviet Union would either be regenerated or become capitalist proved erroneous. It is far better to recognize our error than to insist on our previous prediction and thus be led to the fantastic position of denying that the war is over, as Comrade Cannon has done. 4. Likewise, it is better to recognize the erroneousness of the prediction of a great revolutionary wave emerging in the course of the war. A correct understanding of the slow tempo of the class struggle today in Europe provides a correct selection of the tactics necessary for today, particularly the extreme importance of such democratic demands as the Republic in Belgium and Italy, the Constituent in Italy, immediate elections in Holland and Belgium, the adoption of a democratic constitution by the French Constituent, etc. Without these democratic slogans as points of departure, demands for nationalization of economy today become empty propaganda. But if Comrade Cannon's line is followed, that the war isn't over and out of it is coming the revolution, then we would have to go back to the line of the November 1945 plenum resolution, which predicted a speedy revolutionary tempo in which democratic demands would play an entirely subordinate role. But to do so would be to abandon everything which the European parties of the Fourth International have painfully had to learn during the past 2 years concerning the central importance today of democratic demands. In view of the publication of the full text of Comrade Cannon's speech in the press as if it were party policy, an editorial shall be published in the Militant stating that the speech was not party policy and correcting the errors made by Comrade Cannon. November 30th, 1945, motion lost, Morrow voting for. Counter-motion to Morrow's motion on Comrade Cannon's speech on the Russian Revolution, adopted by the Socialist Workers' Party Political Committee. Comrade Morrow's motion on Comrade Cannon's speech on the Russian Revolution is factionally motivated, and the object of it is to, quote, outlaw, end quote, any public party advocacy of our policy, a defense of the Soviet Union against imperialist attack. It is designated to serve the minority faction as a basis for a political rapprochement with the Shachtmanites, which they have been seeking so desperately. While the resolution of the 11th Party Convention pushed to the fore the, quote, defense of the European Revolution against all its enemies, end quote, it also stated that, quote, our policy of unconditional defense of the Soviet Union against imperialist attack retains all its validity, end quote. From this point of view, Comrade Cannon's speech was entirely within the framework of party policy. If Comrade Morrow wishes to, quote, reevaluate, end quote, the Russian question, as he indicated in his speech at the New York membership meeting, and to challenge the principled position of the party from the viewpoint of Shachtmanism, as he indicated in private conversation, let him quit playing hide-and-seek with the party and write a resolution and submit it to the party for discussion. 4th of December 1945, motion carried, Morrow voting against. Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 7, Number 13, December 1945. Again, this piece was labeled, Is World War II Really Over? By Felix Morrow, Socialist Workers' Party, 1945. The next piece is titled My Theoretical Principles of Marxism by Arne Swabik. This is from 1946. It was originally from a piece titled The Minority's Attitude Toward Theory, dated the 17th of November 1945, written under the name S. Simmons, Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 8, Number 11, January 1946. Comrade Goldman spoke in debate with Comrade Larson in Chicago, August 19th. Anticipating questions over Goldman's proposal to explore the possibility of fusion with the Workers' Party, Goldman attempted to answer them in advance. Goldman maintains that the question of defense of the Soviet Union has receded into the background. It is not to be considered an obstacle to unity, because the question of defense of the Soviet Union is unlikely to become an issue in the next 5 years. Further, in regard to theory, he said that theory must finally be settled by history, and even the theory of a socialist society will only be settled by the establishment of a socialist society. Goldman then raised the question of what we would do if a bureaucratic form of government similar to that in Russia should be established in the United States, a socially advanced country. Why would we not be forced to reconsider our theory? There is a weakness of theoretical principle here which no one who calls himself a socialist should ever permit. This is no criticism of theory by testing it with reality, but is an unscientific attitude toward the theoretical foundations of Marxism. Marxism is scientific socialism and the only socialist movement which has remained loyal to its principles. The theory of Marxism, like theories in other fields where careful analysis and exact fidelity to material reality is necessary, is the result of lifetimes of investigation and participation in the movement of society. They are the necessary consequences of it, and the only explanation which can be given for these facts. A theory is not, quote, only a theory, end quote, which can be treated lightly. Advancement in scientific knowledge is not possible where a light opinion is held of scientific theory, which is its foundation. At best, it could only advance amid the greatest confusion. Many things such as radio waves, planets, etc., have been predicted before they were ever known because they were the necessary conclusions to the principle of science. Theory flows logically from reality and explains reality. When further advance is made, it takes as its point of departure the theory out of which it grows. Advance is made from theory, not apart from all. Advance is made from it, not apart from all that has happened in the past. Marxism derives Marxism's great powers from Marxism's historical necessity. Marxism analyzes the component parts of society and points out the driving forces, the class character of society. In spite of the organized opposition, Marxism will not be destroyed. It is being forced into existence by the nature of material reality. We accept Marxism's theoretical principles as something, not which may come into existence, but which must come. When you desert Marxist theory, you must inevitably lose the historical necessity for your organization. This is what has happened to many groups in the past. Contrary to what Comrade Goldman may expect, we are not worried about disagreement with the Workers' Party over defense of the Soviet Union in the next 5 years. That may or may not be true. What is important is that the Workers' Party betrayed the theoretical principles of Marxism in 1940. Comrade Goldman says he agrees to this, that he was right in 1940. Then instead of seeking peace with the Workers' Party, it is they who must make their peace with Marxism. Nobody can do that for the Workers' Party. It's not enough to push all that has happened to one side and go from there, even if that were possible. There must be a crystal clear understanding of the principles involved. Goldman raises the objection that it is not necessary for them to come publicly beating their breast and confessing their errors. No one expects them to publish it in the Chicago Tribune, but if there has been any change, they must at least tell us. What is the Workers' Party's position on the nature of the state? What is the Workers' Party's concept of party organization? Does the Workers' Party still accept as part of their theoretical principle that the bureaucratic government of Russia is a new class? These differences are not, quote, possible within one party, end quote, when the party accepts Marxist theory as necessary for that party's very existence. Far more fundamental than insisting that they do not publish a, quote, separate public organ, end quote, is the necessity of coming to theoretical understanding which will eliminate the need for one. It is true that even the theory of a socialist society will only be settled by the establishment of a socialist society. It is precisely because history settles the fate of theories that we take such an exacting and careful attitude toward Marxist theory. It must first be correct, then we must conduct our activity on the basis of it. The future of the Workers' Party will be affected by its theoretical foundation. If that is incorrect, they cannot possibly be the party of the proletarian revolution. Again, that's the end of the piece, which was labeled My Theoretical Principles of Marxism by Arne Swabik from 1946, originally coming from a piece titled The Minority's Attitude Toward Theory, dated 17th of November 1945, and written under the name S. Simmons. Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 8, Number 1, January 1946. The next piece is labeled What Kind of Party Should We Build? By Felix Morrow, 1946. This is from the Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 8, Number 5, September 1945. Rumors are circulating concerning my relation to our faction. It is being said I never did agree with Goldman on the, quote, organization question, end quote, and that I now wish to abandon the fight for inviting the Workers' Party to return to the party. I take this opportunity not only to set the rumors at rest, but also to indicate in brief my basic views on the situation in the party. In Trotsky's lifetime, one felt free to try to make contributions to the ideas of the movement. I well remember with what a sense of freedom I wrote my Spanish pamphlets. If I were wrong on one question or another, I was assured that when Trotsky would examine it, he would do so in all comradeliness and seek to prove I was wrong without impugning my motives, character, or revolutionary integrity. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case for everybody. Trotsky created an atmosphere of free exchange of ideas, of hospitality, to attempts to find what is new in a situation, of striving to add something to what has already been said. After his death, however, the political committee majority tended more and more to create a very different kind of atmosphere. Comrade Cannon calls it conservatism, justified by the fact that our resolutions since 1940, quote, stand up, end quote. But as I demonstrated in the balance sheet, the piece titled The Balance Sheet of the Discussion on Europe, repetition of formulas in the face of new events leads to flagrant violations of the traditions of our movement. The fact that the political committee majority sincerely thinks it is clinging conservatively to the, quote, fundamentals, end quote, of Trotskyism does not prevent it from throwing overboard much of the political methodology of Trotskyism. I think that Logan, Goldman, and I have demonstrated that in our articles of the past year. I shall not repeat here a summary of the political errors of the political committee majority. My point is that more important than these errors is the attitude which causes them, which also leads to the PC majority never to admit its errors, which leads it to resent bitterly all differences of opinion. It is this attitude which is the foundation stone of the false conception of the party held by Comrade Cannon and his associates. Their attitude can be summarized as follows: to refuse to consider any difference as being a legitimate difference of opinion, as between comrades who remain equally revolutionary, to dub the difference, quote, fundamental, end quote, and fight it in the spirit of war to the death, not to argue by reasoning against the ideas of the opponent, but to try to discredit the opponent by amalgams which equate the opponent with renegades and class enemies. It is true that at times they are compelled to retreat from this attitude. Thus, after more than a year of fulminations against the minority's ideas on the European situation as being fundamental differences, revisionist, etc., the PC majority switched to saying that the differences were secondary, matters of emphasis, etc. But within a few weeks the political committee majority reverted to its fulminations, this time against the slogan of the Republic in Italy and Belgium. At this moment again we are witnessing a partial retreat of the political committee majority in connection with the minority proposal for unity negotiations with the Workers' Party, which yesterday the political committee majority was condemning as conciliationism with Menshevism, disloyalty to the party, etc. But it is all too clear that the political committee majority considers such retreats as tactical maneuvers and has not changed its attitude toward opponents in the party. I consider the method of the political committee majority as alien to the conception of the party of Lenin and Trotsky. Trotsky taught us that, quote, it is in contradictions and differences of opinion that the working out of the party's public opinion inevitably takes place, end quote. Trotsky taught us that, quote, there should be no oversimplification and vulgarization in the understanding of the thought that party differences, and this holds. There should be no oversimplification and vulgarization in the understanding of the thought that party differences, and this holds up. Sorry, this might just be a weird sentence. All the more for groupings are nothing but a struggle for influence of antagonistic classes, ... It frequently happens that the party is able to solve one and the same problem by different means, and differences arise as to which of these means is the better, the more expeditious, the more economical. These differences may, depending on the question, embrace considerable sections of the party, but that does not necessarily mean that you have their two-class tendencies, end quote. When Trotsky sometimes, after the most thorough discussion and after the most indubitable evidence, finally concluded that an opponent reflected the pressure of alien classes, Comrade Cannon practically always, and at the beginning of a dispute, sets the tone by declaring it as a class struggle, and then, logically enough, conducts the, quote, discussion, end quote, with the opponent in the spirit of civil war. Comrade Cannon is guilty precisely of the, quote, oversimplification and vulgarization, end quote, that Trotsky warned against, and Cannon has carried it so far that it has become a veritable system alien to the Bolshevism of Lenin and Trotsky. I have agreed in all essentials with Goldman's criticisms of this Bolshevism a la Cannon. The one point on which I disagree with Goldman is his use of the terms, quote, Stalinist germs, end quote, and, quote, Stalinist attitude, end quote, to describe Cannon's attitude toward differences of opinion. These terms are too easily manipulated by the Cannon group who pretend that they could not object to our speaking of a false tendency, but that they object to the term, quote, Stalinist, end quote, because it confuses phenomena belonging to very different causes. Imputing to Goldman and myself the idea that we are saying that this is a Stalinist party, they claim that we of course will not remain in a Stalinist party, and that we are making our farewell speeches to the party. Both imputations are untrue. We do not believe this is a Stalinist party, but that Bolshevism a la Cannon is a false tendency, which is making dangerous inroads into the authentic Bolshevik traditions of our party. Where am I? Sorry, I spaced out and I forgot where I was. Imputing to Goldman and myself the idea that we are saying that this is a Stalinist party, they claim that we of course will not remain a Stalinist party, and they were making our farewell speeches to the party. Both imputations are untrue. We do not believe this is a Stalinist party, but that Bolshevism a la Cannon is a false tendency, which is making dangerous inroads into the authentic Bolshevik traditions of our party. Goldman and my other associates, just as much as I, are ready to join the political committee majority in any reasonable ways and means of guaranteeing the maximum functioning of the party during this dispute. But it takes two to make such a bargain. The Cannon group, instead embarking on the hoary but still useful trick of creating a crisis atmosphere in the party and then blaming the minority for precipitating a crisis which interferes with the functioning of the party. As part of this trick, the Cannon group shouted that the minority means to split and refused to discuss the question of unity with the Workers' Party on its merits until the, quote, split danger, end quote, is warded off. In my debate with Comrade Collins in Detroit, I say that the minority would find ways and means to assure the party membership that we are neither splitters nor agents of the Workers' Party in order to attempt to get the Cannon group to discuss unity with the Workers' Party on the merits of the question. I was ready to go to the length of dissolving our faction. Upon reflection, however, it is all too clear to me that such a step would not serve the interest of the party. It would not succeed in its immediate aim of getting a calm and conscientious discussion of unity with the Workers' Party. It was before we formed our faction that Comrade Cannon had already denounced Goldman and me as agents of the Workers' Party. Had we dissolved our faction, Cannon's fire would then have concentrated on our talks with Shachtman. Had we stopped talking to Shachtman, Cannon's fire would have concentrated on the, quote, anti-Bolshevism, end quote, of Morrow and Goldman, in short, on anything but rational discussion of the resolution on unity. We would have discovered our faction without gaining the aim of a conscientious discussion. Far more important, however, is the fact that dissolution of the faction would only lead to, at best, to a postponement of the question of which our resolution on unity with the Workers' Party is only a part, the contending conceptions of a Bolshevik party. Our resolution on unity is merely one example of how a really Bolshevik leadership would conduct itself. Our resolution flows from our basic conception of a Bolshevik party as one in which differences of opinion, such as those between us and the Workers' Party, are compatible with membership in one party, our conception of the party as a broad unity of the proletarian vanguard, and not a tight-knit faction as the political committee majority conceives the party. It is better to accept this fight for what it is, a single fight in which all disputed questions are interrelated. I now see that one of the most important of these questions is the nature of a faction and the right to form a faction. The Cannon Group has made this question important by distorting it beyond recognition, and the minority has the duty to pose it correctly and explain it. Here I limit myself to recalling what Trotsky warned is the end result of such a hue and cry against factions as the Cannon Group is now conducting. Quote, "If factions are not wanted, there must not be any permanent groupings. If permanent groupings are not wanted, temporary groupings must be avoided. Finally, in order that there be no temporary groupings, there must be no differences of opinion, for wherever there are two opinions, people inevitably group together." End quote. Cannon's fight against our having a faction is in the last analysis a fight against any right of differences of opinion in the party. To dissolve our faction would tend to give credibility to Cannon's conception, and would go a long way to fastening Cannon's conception irrevocably on the party. This result would be 100-fold worse for the party than any possible immediate gain for the discussion of the unity resolution which would result from dissolution of our faction. To conclude, I repeat, it is better to accept the present dispute for what the present dispute is, a single issue in which all questions in dispute are interrelated. What kind of party do we want? That is the issue, and on it I was and remain in complete solidarity with my associates in our faction. August 29, 1945. Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 8, Number 5, September 1945. Again, this piece was labeled "What Kind of Party Should We Build" by Felix Morrow from 1945, originally published in the Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 8, Number 5, September 1945. The next piece is also by Felix Morrow, but it's from 1946 and is labeled "You Cling to Outworn Formulas." It's a long piece. Sorry, I'm looking for... This is from a piece titled "Minority Report to Plenum" from May 19, 1946, Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 8, Number 8, June 1946. With each succeeding day, it would become more and more impossible to repeat the outworn formulas of the pre-conference resolution. This mad clinging to outworn formulas, that is the source of all the disputes between us. What Comrade Cannon calls our, quote, "unchanging program," end quote. There is the heart of the dispute. For Cannon and Cannon's followers, the program must not have rude hands laid upon the program. The program is sacred, inviolable. Comrade Cannon describes his method well enough in a letter of August 16, 1944. Cannon wrote, quote, "This carefulness, this aversion to the practice of going off half-cocked, the habit of waiting to think things through before we speak, has been denominated, quote, conservatism," end quote, by light-minded Feuilleton writers who imagine themselves to be altar politicians. But it is this very, quote, conservatism, end quote, that has given all our previous resolutions since the death of the old man, Trotsky, their thought-out character, and made them stand up from year to year as supplements logically flowing from one unchanging program, and like the program itself needs no fundamental revision, end quote. Quote, unchanging program, quote, no fundamental revision. This is the method of Cannon and of the pre-conference resolution. According to Cannon and the pre-conference resolution's method, it is more virtuous to say the earth is flat than to go off half-cocked and say the earth is round. I must confess that Cannon used to scare me with his thunderous proclamations against changing the program. I accepted the implication that the onus, the burden of proof, is on the one who wanted to change something, but that's a lot of nonsense. There is no burden of proof in these matters. Those who want to stand still and those who want to change are equals, equally responsible for defending their positions. What hair-raising nonsense the majority has defended in the name of the unchanging program. In the name of the unchanging program, Comrade Cannon, you taught the following things: that our proletarian military policy means that we should telescope together overthrow of capitalism in defense of the country against foreign fascism; that the Polish revolutionaries should subordinate themselves to the Russian army; that there is an objectively revolutionary logic brought about by the Russian victories; that naked military dictatorships are the only possible governments in Europe because it is impossible to set up a new series of Weimar republics in Europe; that American imperialism is at least as predatory as Nazi imperialism in its methods in Europe; that it is theoretically impossible for America to help rebuild or feed Europe; that there are no democratic illusions in Europe; that there are no illusions about American imperialism; that amid the revolutionary upsurge it is reformist to call for the Republic in Greece, Italy, and Belgium, or the Constituent Assembly. To speak of a Stalinist danger to the European Revolution is only possible for a professional defeatist. That the fate of the Soviet Union will be decided by the war, but only careless people think the war is over. What happened to those planks in your unchanging program, Comrade Cannon? I notice they aren't in the international resolution. Is their disappearance, to use your expression, a typographical error? ... It is fruitful, comrades, to look back and see how this dispute began. Central to our understanding of the dispute is to understand the situation created by the death of Trotsky. The death of Trotsky was bound sooner or later to lead to a political crisis of the Fourth International. That is what we are confronted with, a political crisis on an international scale. It was bound to happen because Trotsky's death created a gap which nobody could fill either individually or collectively. In answer to the quote independent thinkers, end quote, Cannon used to say, quote, Trotsky is my brain, end quote. When the brain died, Cannon and Gabriel, bracket, Michel Pablo, or Raptisse, end bracket, tried to freeze the program as the program stood. That is, the source of the political crisis. In Trotsky's lifetime, Trotsky's genius and authority made the necessary process of change relatively easy. There were, of course, disputes and splits, but they were reduced to a minimum not only by Trotsky's authority, but also by Trotsky's readiness to change when change was indicated. One example in the history of our party will indicate what I mean. In 1938, the Republican Congressman Ludlow introduced a proposed constitutional amendment for a referendum on war. I was then in Minneapolis editing the Northwest Organizer of the Teamsters movement. I was for critical support of the Ludlow Amendment and proceeding to show in the pages of the Northwest Organizer how revolutionary Marxists could make revolutionary propaganda through critical support of the referendum on war. The question came up in the political committee. Burnham supported my position. Comrade Goldman opposed me sharply. Comrade Shankton hound for my reformist head. Comrade Cannon, if I recall, took the same position as Comrade Goldman. The PC voted overwhelmingly against supporting the referendum on war. Trotsky saw the decision in the political committee minutes. Trotsky understood the error immediately, really demonstrated the transitional character of the slogan of a referendum on war. Trotsky's arguments and Trotsky's authority swiftly mustered unanimity in the political committee. That is how the referendum on war was borrowed from Congressman Ludlow and became part of our transition program. It is easy to imagine what would have happened had the referendum on war first arisen as a problem after Trotsky's death. What profound arguments would have been offered against it. Comrade Ward would show that it isn't in our transition program, and it is not an accident that it isn't in there. Comrade Wright would marshal scores of quotations from Trotsky to show that war can be prevented only by overthrowing capitalism. Comrade Cannon would prove conclusively that it is another petty bourgeois deviation. I shudder to think what would have happened had Trotsky died before Trotsky switched positions on the Labor Party, leaving behind all the bad arguments he used up to 1938 against advocating a Labor Party. how those quotations would have been poured over the head of anyone daring to propose a change in position on the Labor Party. Spoon-fed the pap about, quote, unchanging, end quote, program, how many of the new members of the party, and they are now the majority, know that we changed our position on the war referendum and the Labor Party as recently as 1938. Trotsky's death made inevitable a great political crisis in the Fourth International. It was bound to start just as soon as new questions confronted the movement, as new questions will always rise as the years pass. Especially the political crisis was bound to come after World War II, and its aftermath confront us with new questions. ... The majority was blindly determined to cling to the unchanging program, while Logan, Goldman, and I were trying to come to grips with events which more and more failed to fit into the prognosis with which we entered the war. What was that prognosis? The manifesto of the pre-conference dares to say that the prognosis has been confirmed. It can do so only by tailoring its quotations and leaving out the heart of the matter. For the first time in the history of the Trotskyist movement, we can say about our documents that we have nothing to unsay and nothing to conceal. What must be unsaid and what the manifesto and the resolution try to conceal are the two main ingredients of our prognosis of 1940. 1. That in the course of the war the Soviet Union would either collapse into capitalism or be regenerated and victorious. In either case, we would be through with the problem of Stalinism. Soviet victories bringing the Red Army into Europe would inspire a wave of revolution which would in turn topple Stalinism. 2. That galvanized by the ravages of the war and freed of the incubus of Stalinism, the European proletariat would surge forward in a wave of proletarian revolution, the first revolution, Trotsky thought, would come early in the war, on a greater scale than in 1917 to 1921. This did not necessarily mean immediate establishment of Soviet power throughout Europe, but certainly meant the emergence of great mass parties of the Fourth International. By 1948, Trotsky was sure the Trotskyist membership would number in the millions, Trotsky tried to teach us to understand that it is necessary to make a prognosis, but equally necessary to understand that it is impossible to guess the tempos in advance for a prolonged period, and hence one must introduce the necessary correctives into it in the course of experience. This is what the minority tried to do since 1943. The majority answer was that the real issue was not one over tempo, but over fundamental perspective and program. Now in the international resolution, the majority explains that the only mistakes Now in the international resolution, the majority explains that the only mistakes it made were mistakes about tempo. But the tempo has been rendered into the course of this dispute so meaningless that it is better to say, yes, we have profound differences in perspective and program, meaning by these terms the estimate of what is to come during the next few years, and what is to be done about it. Please take note that we are talking of the short-term perspective and not what is to come in a decade or more. We definitely parted company in July 1943. The dispute began with estimating the significance of the fall of Mussolini. The majority proceeded to take it as a complete confirmation of our 1940 prognosis. It rode along its line in the militant, and I rode along a very different line in Fourth International. True, I didn't yet understand the full implications, but comrades who want to understand the roots of this struggle could fruitfully go back and compare the two lines at that time. You won't find the majority's line about the fall of Mussolini in the international resolution, although one might think at least a passing estimate of that event ought to be in the first international resolution of the Fourth International in 6 years. You will find it, however, in a speech of E.R. Frank published as late as February 1945 in Fourth International. There slandering the German comrades, falsely attributing to the German comrades the idea that, quote, they consider the European Revolution already defeated, end quote. E.R. Frank refutes them by the following, quote, we base ourselves on the rising working class revolution. They consider the European Revolution already defeated. We knew that out of the war would come a gigantic revolutionary explosion, above all in Europe, and we were confidently prepared for it. and less than a year after our 1942 convention, Italian fascism crashed to the ground. We saw in the downfall of Mussolini and the beginning of the Italian Revolution the most striking confirmation of our analysis and program, and by the same token, an annihilating refutation of all the theories and speculations of our enemies. We immediately proceeded in our press to subject the Italian events to a thoroughgoing analysis and point to the road ahead." End quote. The alleged thoroughgoing analysis to which E.R. Frank refers was based on a false, arbitrary, obviously factually untrue idea, the idea that Mussolini had been directly overthrown by a revolutionary uprising of the masses. That idea was necessary in order to claim the Italian events as a confirmation of our 1940 prognosis, but it was not true. Recently, our Italian section's Central Committee adopted a resolution on the situation in Italy. It makes clear that no one can understand what has happened in Italy unless he understands that Mussolini was not overthrown by the masses but by a palace coup d'etat. I saw a translation of this resolution the other day on Comrade Karsten's desk. I trust it will be published. In the months between July and the October 1943 plenum, the Italian experience unfolded and mirrored the future of Western Europe. The development of bourgeois democracy, the revival of the dominance of the traditional reformist workers' parties, the central role of such democratic questions as the Republic and the Constituent Assembly, illusions about American imperialism. I tried to explain that at the plenum, and was met with a vicious slander campaign. All this is presumably what the international resolution now admits to have been correct criticisms of leftist exaggerations. The Italian experience showed what had happened to our 1940 prognosis of a wave of proletarian revolution in the course of the war. Instead of the masses overthrowing fascism as we had expected, fascism was being overthrown by fascism's imperialist opponents, not only in Italy but in Germany and occupied Europe as well. Such a purely imperialist conclusion to the war would mean continuation of European capitalism. The one chance to prevent this was the transformation of the ideology of the resistance movement. But to do this, one had to be in it. Our comrades weren't in it thanks to the sectarian prejudices which they shared with the Socialist Workers' Party majority. These sectarian prejudices were buttressed by their theory of the revolutionary consequences of Russian victories. What a terrible tragedy! ! They ignored the revolutionary movement which was everywhere about them, the armed proletariat and peasantry of Western Europe, instead saw the coming revolution being brought by the Russian army. Instead of preparing to play a role in the coming Paris insurrection, they looked to the east for the Red Dawn. There is irony, pitiful irony, in this awful error. Try to realize that what were the consequences of it in Europe. Here, for example, is a typical enough issue of La Vérité, bracket, French Trotskyist newspaper, end bracket, of February 10th, 1944. Its main headlines read as follows, quote, "The flags of the Red Army will join themselves with our red flags," end quote. I am reading from the main article. Quote, "Stalin knows that with the advance of the Soviet army, a general uprising can break out in Europe. Tomorrow, 10,000 factory Soviets can cover the old continent. Stalin knows also that it is less than certain that these workers and peasant Soviets created in the advanced European countries will passively obey the parasitic bureaucracy of Moscow. Stalin cannot ignore the fact that he cannot count upon his army to put down the revolutionary workers of Europe. The army of the USSR will not wipe out the Soviets of Berlin, of Budapest, and of Paris. It is these Soviets, on the contrary, that will remind the Russian army that it is a Soviet army. The communist revolution in Europe will be the end of exploiting capitalism, and also the end of the parasitic bureaucracy. The Moscow usurpers know it, but the Red Army continues to advance. End quote. Was this idea that the Russian army was bringing the socialist revolution, that the Russian army was not the instrumentality... Did I say end quote? End quote. Was this idea that the Russian army was bringing the socialist revolution, that the Russian army was not the instrumentality of the Stalinist bureaucracy, that the Russian army's red flags were still the flags of the revolution. Was this idea some awful aberration of the isolated French comrades in the Paris underground? Or was this idea, as some people pretend, an aberration of John G. Wright? No, comrades, it was the common idea of the Fourth International. Parties of our international, divided by oceans and without contact for many years, were simultaneously repeating the same idea. 7 months after the issue of La Vérité that I had quoted, the very able leadership of the Bolshevik-Leninist Party of India met in conference in September 1944 and adopted a resolution on the Red Army in Eastern Europe, which stated, quote, ... particularly the entry of the Red Army will give a powerful impetus to the revolutionary movement. For these reasons, proletarian revolutionaries will not in any way modify the unconditional support given hitherto to the Red Army in its actions against the forces of imperialism, as the Red Army leaves Russian territory in pursuit of the German army. The entry of the Red Army into these territories will release latent forces and give such an impetus to the revolutionary movement as to create a pre-revolutionary situation in Eastern Europe, the heightening of which is of inestimable importance for world revolutionary perspectives, end quote. The Indian comrades went on to warn that, quote, it is certain that the Red Army will be brought into conflict with the developing revolution, either to crush it completely or to bureaucratize the social conquests made, end quote. Their revolutionary understanding made it impossible for them to blind themselves to what the Red Army is. What is important, however, is that in spite of this, they were saying, as our French comrades, that the entry of the Red Army into Europe would give an impetus to the revolutionary movement. 4 months later, the organ of the Belgian party, La Voix de Lénine, of February 4th, 1945, gave as its main headline, quote, the new Soviet victories, are they preparing the German Revolution, end quote. It answered that question affirmatively, the first paragraph saying, quote, scarcely have the Soviet troops penetrated into German, Silesia, then outbreaks take place at Ratibor, Gleiwitz, and Beuthen. The tremendous advance of the Red Army can play a capital role in the uprising which is preparing little by little in Germany against Hitler, end quote. 3 months later, in the May Day 1945 issue of the organ of our comrade in Chile, El Militante, the headline reads, quote, will Europe be Soviet, end quote, and the question is answered affirmatively. The first paragraph reading, quote, when El Militante arrives on the street, making its homage to the 1st of May, Berlin, the capital of German imperialism, the center of fascism, will already be in the hands of the Red Army and of the German workers who have risen writing epic pages against their totalitarian oppressors, end quote. This was the universal theory of the Fourth International. Abler and more educated comrades advanced it in India with more intelligent reservations than the crude formulas of the leadership in Chile, but they shared with all other Trotskyists, except the Workers' Party, the idea that Russian victories, the entry of the Russian army into Europe, would give an impetus to social revolution. What is the source of this theory? Trotsky's writings of 1939 to 40 on the occupation of Poland and the war in Finland. It seemed to Trotsky that when the Russian army entered new territory and sought to turn private property into state property, it can do so only by methods of civil war. Hence Trotsky wrote that the bureaucracy, quote, gives an impulse to the socialist revolution through bureaucratic methods, end quote, in its occupation of Poland. Hence Trotsky wrote of the Kremlin's, quote, appeal to independent activity on the part of the masses in the new territories. Without such an appeal, even if worded with extreme caution, it is impossible to constitute a new regime, end quote. And even more categorically, he wrote about what would have happened if the Finnish war had continued, quote, occupation presupposed a social overturn which would be impossible without involving the workers and poor farmers in civil war, end quote. Trotsky sharply distinguished this first stage, the uprising of the masses, from the second, in which the Stalinist bureaucracy attempts to crush the masses. The distinction meant Stalin can achieve the second stage in God-forsaken Galicia, but if victorious, Red armies occupy countries, but if victorious Red armies occupy advanced countries in West Europe, the socialist revolution, to which the bureaucracy is compelled to give this impulse, will get beyond the control of the bureaucracy and overthrow it. After Trotsky's death, and especially after the USSR survived the first year of war, this idea that the bureaucracy is compelled against its will to, quote, give an impulse to the socialist revolution through bureaucratic methods, end quote, became the main justification for Soviet defensism in the Fourth International. The quotations I have already given from the World Trotskyist Press show that. The theory was proven completely false. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet occupation took place without risings of the masses. It is now clear that the 1939 rising in Poland was not, as Trotsky thought, a necessary, quote, interaction between the masses and the workers' state and the bureaucracy, end quote. In 1939, the illusions of the masses about the, quote, liberating, end quote, Red Army played a great role. There was also deliberate staging by the bureaucracy, which allied then to Hitler, needed the, quote, rising, end quote, to show the masses and the democracies that the USSR was different from the USSR's ally. In 1945, there were fewer illusions in Eastern Europe about the Red Army. Still more important, the bureaucracy had to consider its present democratic allies. The point is that the will of the bureaucracy was sufficient to prevent risings, rather than risings being dictated to the bureaucracy by statification of property. As to risings which could get out of the control of the bureaucracy, the very possibility did not arise. Comrade Natalia saw this very clearly and wrote in this vein to the party in 1944. Under her pressure and appalled by the debacle of our theory of the revolutionary consequences of Soviet victory, the Socialist Workers' Party majority yielded at the last moment and inserted in the convention resolution one of those famous, quote, literary and clarifying amendments, end quote, which the membership had never seen or discussed, the idea that defense of the USSR has receded into the background in the face of the Stalinist danger in the European Revolution. Comrade Natalia's proposal was new and unprecedented. It was based on what was new, the reactionary consequences of Soviet victory. Comrade Natalia's proposal to relegate the slogan of defense to the background was, in my opinion, a halfway house to dropping the slogan of the defense from the program. One cannot defend, fight for, and victories which bring reactionary consequences. The consequences of Russian victory in World War II demonstrate irrefutably that they would be the same consequences in any foreseeable war conducted by the Stalinist bureaucracy. That is why I shall shortly present theses on the Russian question, in which I shall propose not only, as Comrade Natalia originally proposed, to withdraw the slogan of defense from the foreground, but to withdraw it altogether from the program of the Fourth International. If further proof were necessary as to the imperative need for withdrawing the slogan of defense, it is provided by the horrible example of what Russian defensism is doing to the press of the Fourth International. To limit myself only to the militant and only to a few passing examples, try to find out from the militant the Trotskyist position on the Chinese student demonstrations before the Soviet consulates against Russian imperialism in Manchuria. Try to find out what Trotskyists should say about the Polish student demonstrations in Krakow on Polish Independence Day, 3rd of May, against Stalin's puppet government. Try to find out what Trotskyism says about the Stalinist attempts to force the German socialists into a totalitarian, quote, united, end quote, party, or about the profound significance of the overwhelming vote of those socialists against the, quote, unity, end quote. You won't find these things in 100 light questions in the militant, but you will find an article on the, quote, Kremlin's policy inside Germany, end quote, sent special to the militant, April 27th issue, from the International Secretariat, which approvingly quotes, quote, an important article, end quote, from The Economist, that in the Russian zone there exists, quote, a fair amount of resemblance to the factory democracy of the early years of the Russian Revolution, end quote. As if to underline this article appears side by side on one page with one headed, quote, Rule of U.S. imperialism brings starvation to people of Germany, end quote. Let me repeat. That article about factory democracy in the Russian zone was not something cooked up in the militant office to fill a hole in the paper. It was sent by the International Secretariat. How can such madness be? The answer is the same as the answer to all disputes we have had during these 3 years. The majority leadership blindly clings to outworn formulas, to unchanging program, and hence must distort, must falsify what is being revealed by the changing reality. Our theory said there must be revolutionary consequences to Soviet victory, and by God, the majority will find them even if it has to invent them. Out of 10,000 press clippings on the terrible consequences of Soviet occupation of Germany, the International Secretariat picks the rare exception that talks nonsense about factory democracy. And to what terrible reactionary positions the Russian defensists are led by their theory. I confess I did not anticipate that the pre-conference resolution would go so far as to oppose the withdrawal of the Russian troops from the countries it occupied. I never dreamt that any resolution of the Fourth International would appear this paragraph, quote, in the oppressor countries, USA, Great Britain, France, insofar as Germany is concerned, quote, in the oppressor countries, parenthesis, USA, Great Britain, France, insofar as Germany is concerned, end parenthesis, the French Fourth International actively defends the right of the occupied nations to independence and demands the recall of the occupation troops, end quote. Russia is thus deliberately left out of the list of the powers which are oppressing Germany, exclamation point. The other troops must leave, but not the Russian troops. Our Russian party is not to tell the Russian workers that the Russian army must get out of the country it is holding against the will of the occupied peoples. And this foul line, this capitulation to Stalinism, is proclaimed in the name of Trotsky. Here we can see the profoundly reactionary character of the majority's line, not only on the Russian question, but also on the national question. The national struggle for independence of the occupied peoples is not a radical enough struggle for Cannon and Gabriel, who is, Michel Pablo. They want nothing less than the proletarian revolution. Therefore, no struggle to overthrow the Russian armies out of the countries they are oppressing. The facts are now so clear that the majority must admit that there is a national oppression in Eastern Europe. But they admit it only to deny the need for national struggle today. They do so in the following paragraph of the resolution, quote, just like the German occupation, the present occupation of Europe by the Anglo-Americans, French and Russian armies is also the cause of a certain national oppression. Given the perspective of a definite decline in the revolutionary movement, the prolongation for several years of this occupation could throw certain nations back to the level of colonial countries and open a new era of national struggles and wars, end quote. This nonsense is proclaimed in the name of the unchanging program, but it has nothing whatsoever in common with Leninism. Leninism teaches that the national struggle of oppressed countries is our struggle, and that is true even when it is merely called a, quote, certain national oppression, end quote. Leninism teaches us that the national struggle is not a separate stage arising after a decline of the revolutionary movement, but is inextricably part of the revolutionary movement. That is how it happened in the Russian Revolution, and that is how it will happen again in the European Revolution. National struggles occurring simultaneously with and intermingling with the development of the proletarian revolution. Yesterday it was still the ABC of Leninism that the October Revolution succeeded because it supported all national struggles. Today this ABC is condemned as the revision of the quote, three theses, end quote. What is the national question? It is the struggle for democracy against the foreign invader. The Revolutionary Party demands from the occupying power all the democratic rights, including the right of the people to choose its own government freely, which can only be done, isn't that clear, comrades, by ridding the country of the occupying troops. He who does not demand the recall of the Russian troops can spout words about being for the democratic rights and freedom of the occupied peoples, but his words are empty, his words are lies. That's what Lenin taught us about the Austro-Marxists who were for autonomy, for complete democracy, for everything you please to be granted to the subject peoples of the Austrian Empire, but not for the ousting of the Austrian troops. The right of self-determination is the right to throw out the foreign invader. themselves not a little frightened at where their line is to carry them. Themselves not a little frightened at where their line is carrying them. The majority tries to cover it up by phrases and formulas borrowed from the classical centrist position on the national question. Here is just one example in the section of the resolution on, quote, tasks of the countries occupied by the USSR, end quote. Quote, in the European zone occupied by the Red Army, our sections, tolerate the presence of the Red Army only to the extent that it is a friendly proletarian armed force having as its objective to guarantee the fulfillment of agrarian reform and the statization of the means of production against imperialism and against national reactionary elements without hindering in any way whatsoever the free development of the working class movement, end quote. What is this centrist ambiguity doing in a Trotskyist resolution? This is the most classical centrist formula, quote, we support ... only to the extent that, end quote. Bolshevism scorns such claptrap. Bolshevism answers the question, is the Red Army, quote, a friendly proletarian armed force, ... without hindering in any way whatsoever the free development of the working class movement? The answer end quote. The answer, written in the blood of tens of millions of Germans, Austrian, Romanian, Yugoslav, Bulgarian, Polish workers and peasants, in their blood spilled by the GPU or drained from them in slave labor, is that the Red Army is no Red Army, is not a friendly proletarian force, is instead the main enemy of the proletariat of the countries the Red Army occupies and oppresses. He who can talk about the Red Army as a friendly proletarian force has lost his head as a Marxist, has lost his feeling for proletarian democracy, and has objectively capitulated to Stalinism. Why does the international resolution oppose recall of the Russian troops from the countries they oppress? A terrible answer is indicated in the section on the Soviet Union in the following paragraphs. Quote, in order that Soviet economy rise again, in order that this revival be accomplished without resorting to the exclusive or principal aid of American imperialism, which would take advantage of this opportunity to destroy the USSR's independence, in order that the USSR gain a certain protective cover against the pressure of world imperialism, the Soviet bureaucracy finds it necessary to extend its strategic zones and to draw on the economic resources of other countries, in Europe and Asia alike, ... In its defense against both the external pressure of imperialism and of the internal reactionary elements, and in its efforts to rapidly revive the Soviet economy, the bureaucracy's best chances for success lie in the economic contribution of the countries now under Soviet control, end quote. What does this mean except to justify what you call Soviet expansionism and what I call bureaucratic imperialism? And this you dare do in the name of the unchanging program which still, let us hope, says that we are not in favor of seizures of new territory by the Kremlin bureaucracy. To justify its continuation of Russian defensism, the international resolution is compelled to pretend that what we based Russian defensism on in the past has now happened, namely that the entry of the Red Army gave an impetus to the socialist revolution by bureaucratic methods. But we didn't, in 1940, mean by this the statification of property. That wasn't the basis of our revolutionary hope. Our hope was based on the idea that in order to statify the property, the bureaucracy against its will would have to precipitate an uprising of the masses. And now, in spite of all that has happened, the international resolution dares to say that this happened. It says it on page 8, quote, the Soviet occupation and control have given an impetus, although in varying degrees, to civil war and the development of a regime of dual power, ... The promotion of organs of dual power, committees for the control of production and trade, committees of poor peasants to carry out the agrarian reforms, end quote. So, comrades, the Trotskyist world movement is to proclaim that Stalin's Potemkin villages are the real thing, that the farcical pseudo-committees Stalin sets up are veritable organs of dual power. What is dual power? Dual power is a regime in which the formal power is still in the hands of a bourgeois or Stalinist government, but the essence of real power is already in the hands of the rising proletariat organized in Soviets or the equivalent of Soviets. That is what, quote, a regime of dual power, end quote, has meant in the dictionary of our movement. Is that what exists in the Russian zone? So you say on page 8, but 10 pages later we read, quote, in the part of Europe controlled by the USSR, the working class movement has in several places attained the level of dual power, but it has experienced at the same time the bureaucratic straitjacket and the demoralization which are provided by the Stalinist bureaucracy, end quote. Dual power in a bureaucratic straitjacket. That is certainly a novel terminological contribution to Marxism, no doubt in the name of the unchanging program. The international resolution is enabled by such mumbo-jumbo to proclaim the European situation more revolutionary than ever before, by turning the minus of the Russian occupation into the plus of dual power by such a mad method one can call anything revolutionary. More revolutionary than ever before. Please ask yourself a simple question. When was the situation in Western Europe more revolutionary? In August 1944, when the proletariat was armed, or today, when the proletariat has been disarmed? The manifesto of the pre-conference lists the factors whose existence defines a revolutionary situation and asserts they exist in Europe. Time presses, I shall limit to myself to one of them, that the petty bourgeois masses are following the workers' parties. But what is the meaning of the French referendum results, in which the proletariat voted one way and the petty bourgeoisie (the peasantry) the other way, or of the Belgian elections in which the same division took place? Again, the same thing in the Dutch elections. But enough. One final word. The international resolution correctly says, quote, our European sections, having for a long time prior to the war lived on general propaganda, and then during the war having lived isolated from the masses, inexperienced in the strictest illegality, are today finding it difficult to break with the obsolete ideas and methods of organization and activity, end quote. Correct, but very significantly it appears in the resolution in the wrong place, under the wrong heading, quote, organizational tasks, end quote. The obsolete ideas that the European sections are finding difficult to break with are not in the first instance organizational ideas, but political ideas, and they come precisely from the people who are complaining about it. The fish stinks from the head as always. The chief culprit is the international leadership, whose theory of the revolutionary situation bars from aiding the sections in formulating programs of action with which to go to the masses. Just one fantastic example. Not a word in this very, very long document about the question of food. The famine is upon Europe, not for a day or a month, but for years to come. Is the question which preoccupies every man, woman, and child in Europe. It is the question which defines the relations between Europe and America. It is the political question, and it isn't even mentioned in this document, much less is it submitted to a program of action for struggle against the famine. That alone is enough to characterize the bankruptcy of the political line of this document. The end. Again, this piece was labeled You Cling to Outworn Formulas, and it was by Felix Mara from 1946. And in the footnote it says, Minority Report to Plenum, May 19, 1946, Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 8, Number 8, July 1946. That is also the end of Chapter 10. So, thank you for listening. This is the end of the video.